Right, so today I got to talk about something that's very important, especially in times like this. We have a massive push right now that is largely false. I don't believe it's 100% false. I just think it's the severity of the problem is vastly overstated. And that being this idea of, oh, systemic racism and all this stuff that's talked about. Um, and again, the other thing to point out too is that I'm not 100% against police reform or any of this garbage too. Like the same thing being is that I think that the police, the way policing is done, just needs to be tweaked a little bit. Like just needs to be tweaked a little bit. I mean, not to mention you should constantly be looking for ways to improve the system. The problem is that um, the BLM people, the most people on the left, they want to completely and like radically transform the way things are being done. And the problem with it is that they don't really offer up a good solution. They just want to just destroy the system. And that's the problem too, is that, how the old saying goes is that people who complain about problems without offering up a good solution are just people who are complainers, right? And they're just whining, right? So that they deserve people who again, I don't care whether or not you think it's true or not, too. Like, if you want to complain about a problem and you don't offer up a better solution, then I could care less about your opinion because, again, you're not offering up a realistic solution. So that's the first thing. But the main thing I wanted to get into in this video is the real problems facing society, specifically the black community. Now, you look at this tweet from PragerU here, and they point out children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. So, which poses a bigger threat to black communities? Racism or absent fathers? Now, it's so obvious it's not even funny. Again, what the answer to that question is, and it's not racism, right? Like people, and this is the thing too. Another way I've pointed out many ways that if the BLM crowd was right, um, they would point to a specific, study or piece of evidence that shows that blacks commit crime at a rate of, whatever. Let's say, you know, 20%. I think they're a lot higher, but let's just say it's 20%, and they're 30% of the prison population. Well, that would prove that there is some racism, right? Because they're in prison at a rate higher than the amount of crime that they commit. And that's the reason that you know that these people, again, either they have literally no idea what they're talking about whatsoever, or they're just trying to manipulate people because, again, their argument is, oh, blacks are, or whatever, 13% of the population, and they're, whatever, 3 times more likely than that to be in prison. Therefore, racism. But that doesn't prove anything because it's simply assuming correlation means causation, right? That's simply assuming that. But again, you could make the same argument that, oh, men are 50% of the population, but they're 90% of the prison population, therefore sexism. But nobody takes that as proof of sexism because although most people have probably never seen studies, but everybody knows that men are a lot more likely to commit crimes. Therefore, they don't let you claim sexism, right? So the way you would prove that there is sexism or racism or whatever you're trying to prove is that you would have to prove that the percent of the population commits crime at whatever rate, and their percentage of people in prison for committing whatever crime you're looking at is higher than said number. And not only that, it would have to be at least 5% different, right? Because there's room for error. And because they never do that, it's just proof, I would say, that there's no such thing. Because the fact that they have to use these, assuming correlation causation things just proves that they don't have actual evidence. So, getting back to the main point here, the real issue facing the black community is single parenthood. I believe the number is around what 75% of black kids grow up in single parents. No, like 99% of the time, single mother households. And we know the studies are very clear that kids who grow up in single mother, specifically households, another thing too to point out here is that single dad households, even though they're incredibly rare compared to single mother, I don't believe the kids are actually more likely to end up in poverty, crime, or any of this kind of stuff. I don't believe, and if they are, it's not nearly to the extent. So it's something specifically going on with single mother households. Um, but again, the point being is that if they really care about poverty and prison and all this kind of stuff, the fact that they literally never bring this up just goes to show that at the very least they are manipulating people, and at worst they're outright lying and grossly manipulating people, right? Because again, I don't know how many times you have to state this, but again, if they really cared about improving the black community as a whole, they would be addressing these issues. Now, why do they not do that? Because again, people are probably wondering, well, if this is the real cause, well, then why is nobody doing it? Well, the real reason is that or the reason why people don't call this out more is that number one, people on the left are dependent upon these people for votes, right? Like we know that single mothers over, I think the numbers are like 80-90% vote for the left. And not only that, the kids of single mothers are a lot more likely to vote for the left compared to the average person as well. So people on the left have no incentive to call these people out because it would hurt them. It would lose votes for them. So one side of the political spectrum is not going to call them out no matter what. And if anything, people, these leftist politicians are more likely to encourage, to create policies that encourage this behavior. And they do that, right? Because it's always the left that wants to increase welfare programs, give people more free stuff, all this kind of stuff. So now that we have that one side covered, well, why does the right not do it? The right does do it to a small extent, but they don't do it, I think, partially because um, the first thing being is that if they were to really, really, push hard up against this kind of stuff, what would happen is people would call them out for hating the poor, right? Because if you the way to solve these problems, or at least I would say the simplest, is to not have government programs that encourage this kind of stuff. And the way you would do this kind of stuff is that you would have to cut back on welfare benefits and on stuff like that, right? So um, the reason they don't do that is because if they did do that, they would get accused of hating the poor and hating women. And it's the same reason why most right wing politicians don't call out BLM or don't call out this radical, stuff that's going on is because they don't like being accused of being racist. I mean, it's the same thing for the average citizen. Like the average person knows BLM is a bunch of crazy people. Um, but most people don't call them out. Most people aren't vocal about it because they're afraid of being racist. And it's not simply just the matter of people afraid of being racist too. People nowadays get doxxed. Violence is routinely committed against these politicians and people in general. So it's no longer just simply people calling you names. I mean, that's something that scares people enough. But there's a lot of physical violence, and not only that, get fired from their jobs for this kind of stuff too. So that is I think the main reason why people on the right or people who aren't on the left don't call this kind of stuff out. So the big problem is that there's no real incentive, especially for left-wing politicians, to call this kind of stuff out, and that's the big problem. And I think the bigger problem is that the incentive isn't going to come to pass until the problem gets to a tipping point. And what's going to happen when the problem gets to a tipping point is that a lot of people are going to die and suffer even more than they already are, right? Like ignoring a problem almost always just makes it get worse, right? Like it almost never gets better. It almost always just gets worse. And that's, I think, the main problem when it comes to this kind of stuff. So um, anyway, I just wanted to bring that up because, again, it's just a massive lie in society that, oh, systemic racism is this huge issue. But and here's the other thing too, that you would know that if this kind of stuff isn't an issue, you would adjust for black kids that grow up in two parent, married, stable families. I'd like to see data on those kind of people. And again, because they don't show you data on that kind of stuff, I think just proves the narrative even more. Because again, if systemic racism was this huge thing, then you would see black kids who grow up in stable two-parent households where they're married, all that kind of stuff. You would see them in prison just as likely as the kids who grow up in the single-parent households. And again, because they don't show you that, and if that were the case, if the kids growing up in the two-parent households had all these terrible things happen to them at the same rate as the kids in single-parent households, then that would be evidence that would prove, or at least some evidence that would, come to prove the whole systemic racism narrative. And because they don't show you that data, I think it just goes to show that the reason they don't do it is because it would disprove their whole narrative. So anyway, that's another thing I wanted to bring up. So anyway, if you liked the video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, BitChute, and Parler. All those links are in the description, so you can find them all there. And the last thing, make sure you stay tuned for more.